A decade ago, I traveled with several of my colleagues to Kyoto as chair of the congressional delegation to the now famous climate change treaty that was being negotiated there. Early on, I had suspicions that a treaty which targeted emissions by the U.S. and other industrialized countries but ignored the CO2 released by emerging economies like China and India would not get a warm reception either in Congress or amongst the American public. In fact, the U.S. Senate made a big statement prior to the Kyoto negotiations by voting 95-0 to express opposition to negotiating any climate change treaty that would harm the U.S. economy and fail to include emerging economies. One consequence of that vote was that President Clinton decided not to even bother sending the Kyoto Treaty to the Senate for ratification, even though he signed it. Perhaps the reason for that was that his appointee as head of the Energy Information Agency, a part of the United States Department of Energy, testified in 1998 before the Science Committee that compliance with Kyoto would result in approximately an 80% increase in the cost of energy in the United States, whether that be electricity, fuel oil, natural gas, or gasoline. And those types of increases are neither economically sustainable nor politically sustainable, because no politician in a democracy can get reelected if they support increasing the cost of energy by 80% on their voters. So the problem was not with the Congress nor with the Senate, but with an administration with the help from former Vice President Al Gore that pursued a treaty that was very popular with people overseas, but which have no chance of ratification in the United States. We must not make that mistake again. Momentum is building for a new global climate change treaty. We're continued this week with the UN's high-level event on Monday, which will continue later this week with the State Department's meeting of world major economies, which the President will address on Friday. These two meetings will help lay the groundwork for more formal negotiations this December in Bali, Indonesia, where diplomats from around the world will try to find out what was missed in Kyoto, which is a treaty that can produce positive environmental results without creating economic havoc. A decade after Kyoto, it is clear to me that the treaty produced far too few results. It is a failure, and I'm not alone. This week, the executive director of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Dutch diplomat Ivo de Boer, stated that from the perspective of the environment, Kyoto could be considered a failure. He said, and I quote, "You could, I suppose, say it's a failure from the point of view of the atmosphere, from the point of view of the climate because it's only managing to reduce greenhouse gases by a little under 5%. So in that sense, you could call it a failure," unquote. Mr. de Boer did offer some praise for the Kyoto Treaty by putting in place some needed architecture, but this statement alone tells me that Bali must not be a 21st century version of Kyoto. And let me state that contrary to what I expect to hear from our witnesses today and from the opening statement of the chair of the committee, that if we continue on in the business of talking about a mandatory cap and trade system that China and India will never sign off on, we will have repeated the mistake that began in Berlin in 1995, was continued in Kyoto in 1997, and which continues to this day. I give President Bush a lot of credit for engaging the Chinese and the Indians, which have so far stonewalled any type of talk about greenhouse gas reductions into getting into these discussions. And he should be given praise and not condemnation for that. I was also pleased to see Secretary General Ban Ki-moon say on Monday that a complete divorce from fossil fuels is unrealistic and that technological development is essential for progress on global warming. I think Secretary of State Rice is right when she said on Monday, the world needs a technological revolution. I would add that the world also needs a revolutionary new climate change treaty that will keep energy and economic growth abundant while making carbon dioxide scarce. Validating old press releases isn't going to do it, and I hope that this week's discussion will move us down that path. Very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me say that with the discussions that I've heard this morning and what I've been hearing in the last few months, I am really discouraged about any type of a framework coming out of the Bali conference that will have any chance of public acceptance or ratification in the United States. And I can see history repeating itself on Kyoto in the 21st century as a result of the Bali conference. I'd like to make a couple of points. I'm not going to ask any questions, but I hope you'll listen to these points because I've been involved in this issue for about 12 years. First of all, there will be no mandatory reductions in greenhouse gases acceptable in the United States unless it is worldwide, specifically China and India and other emerging economies like Brazil and Mexico. Otherwise, this treaty ends up being more about jobs and economics and where those are rather than the environment. And that's what the Kyoto Treaty was. Having had a number of bilateral engagements with the Chinese delegation to climate change conferences, they will not agree to any type of mandatory reduction in greenhouse gases. Or if they do so, they'll simply ignore what their international obligations are. And China has got a record of doing that. And we all thought we'd get rid of intellectual property rights piracy by bringing China into the WTO, and I think everybody who's looked at this realistically realizes that piracy is worse now that China is in the WTO than it was before Chinese accession to the WTO. The second point I'd like to make on this is that in any democracy, telling our voters that going along with this will result in an 80% increase in the cost of their electricity, the cost of their natural gas to heat their houses, the cost of the fuel to fuel their automobiles is simply not sustainable. And that's what President Clinton's direct appointee testified before the Congress in 1998. It simply can't be done. And all of you have run for office and have served in government in your respective countries before. You can't go tell your voters that an 80% increase in the cost of what they have to pay to live is something that is going to, number one, get you reelected, but number two, will not push the pendulum so far over into the other direction that there will be in the next election just a complete and utter rejection of these types of policies. And I want to give you two examples of this. George W. Bush would not be the President of the United States today. Al Gore would be the President of the United States today if it were not for Gore's embracing of the Kyoto Protocol, which was a significant impact in him losing West Virginia and Ohio in the 2000 election. The 2000 election was the first election where a Republican carried West Virginia in a non-incumbent race since 1928. The other thing is one of the things that helped the Republicans win control of the Congress in 1994 was the carbon tax that Mr. Gore proposed, in which the House of Representatives passed, but which the Senate did not pass. That carbon tax ended up being lethal in the eyes of the American voters. Now, we all know that politics is the art of the possible. And I'd like to see something happen in this area, but it has got to be both economically sustainable and politically sustainable. Without China agreeing to some type of reduction in greenhouse gases, it will be neither in the United States. I don't think that any of us want to get on board any kind of an international treaty that ends up outsourcing more American jobs to countries like China and like India. This is my message. It is a message that is sincerely given You look back at what happened over the last 12 years, and I think the biggest mistake that was made in the entire process leading up to Kyoto and subsequent to Kyoto was the decision that was made in Berlin in 1995 to exempt the third world from any type of greenhouse gas emissions and to give the European Union a significantly less reduction quota in greenhouse gases because of a couple of factors that are entirely unrelated to this issue. Thank you.